The stats for small business failure within the first year isn't great at all, around 20%. And the stats for failure within the first 5 years is even worse. In the UK, it's 60%. Worldwide, we're talking 50%. And when I hear these stats, I feel a little sad, to be honest, because I feel very connected to new business owners and I've got a lot of empathy for the new business journey. So I wanted to give you a list of some businesses to watch out for when you're looking to start your very first business. And if you don't know who I am, I'm Michael J. I build 6 and 7 figure businesses, and it is my absolute passion and calling in life to teach as many people how to do the same thing. And in this video, I'm going to walk through 5 businesses that you absolutely should avoid, especially if it's your first one. So jumping straight into it, the first business that I feel that you should absolutely avoid is to open a restaurant. And if you remember the stats I mentioned earlier in the video, these stats are even worse. So the failure within the first year for restaurants is 60%, and failure within the first 5 years is 80%. And if you really think about it, owning a restaurant sounds really cool, to be honest. I don't know whether that's just me, but I do speak to a lot of business coaching clients and just people in business in general, and everyone would love a really nice restaurant. It's just got a romance to it, right? Just one of those type of businesses, and people go into it for that. They're going to it for the passion and love of setting up a business in the restaurant world. And that's probably why there's such a high rate of failure, because people go into it and they don't look at the hard, cold stats of it. And so the business end of it is just not looked at vigorously enough. And so that's when all the issues are caused. And very quickly, people start seeing the cold, hard truth. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these businesses just go out of business within the first year. And just imagine how devastating that would be. Really excited for this passion project of setting up a restaurant, and then when the cold hard facts start hitting you and you're not making any money and you have to shut, that must be absolutely soul destroying. And one of the main reasons why a lot of these restaurants fail is because there's a lot of money to put up front, yes, and that's one big problem why I would not recommend it for first timers. Kitting out a restaurant is very expensive, but people don't take into account the expenses ongoing, just in case they don't make any money and they don't get any custom within the first 6 to 9 months. Most new businesses that come into the restaurant world are probably going to be sat empty for a few months unless you've been very good at marketing and you've got a really unique selling point. But the chances are very high that you're probably going to be sat there empty for at least 3 months, and you've got to plan that in. And there are a lot of costs with those ongoing costs. So you've got staff costs, which is one of the biggest costs, to be honest. You've got the venue costs, so the rent, because these restaurants are obviously much bigger than a normal like coffee shop, for example, or a fish and chip shop. They're big, and so the rents are very high. And so when you've got these high costs for months on end and you've hardly got any customers, yes, you might have the odd customer trickling through, but it's not going to be enough to cover your high staff costs, your rent costs, and obviously those are just 2 of them. You've got your utilities, you've got your materials, your supplies. The list can go on, and it can come in the tens of thousands. If you get a smaller place, it might be in the thousands, but most places you're probably talking over 10 grand. Just take into account just the staff, for example. If you've got 3 waiters, 2 chefs, and someone on the tills, that's 6 members of staff. Let's say they earn 1,500 quid a month alone, that's around 9 grand, and it's probably going to be more than that, and that's just staff costs alone. And just a little bit more about staff. The more a business relies upon staff, especially good staff, the more risky it is, the more headaches you get, and to be honest, it's very difficult to manage all that. It just causes more stress. Not only stress, you've got all the costs of it, and just imagine if 1 or 2 people call in sick, it can cause real nightmares. You've got to try and get people in last minute, you might have to jump in, and so it just brings a whole load of issues. And then you've got the specialist staff problems. Let's say you've got a really top end chef and you need that person to make the business run. If that person doesn't call in, or you're just having issues with them and they want to stamp their authority down and not turn up, again, that is an absolute nightmare, and you might not even be able to open the restaurant at that point. So you can see that you can have bottlenecks with these very specialist skills, and they're obviously very expensive. And then you've got the competitiveness of the restaurant industry. There are hundreds of thousands of restaurants in the world, probably millions. And if you go to a main city, there's one around every corner. Probably every third shop or commercial premises is a restaurant. And so you have got a lot of competition. And so when you're coming out with a restaurant and you're trying to, create a scene in this city that you're going in, you need a unique selling point. You need to be very unique. And this is where I see a lot of people go wrong. They just come into it as a me too, and it just doesn't work because these other people that are the me too's doing it in the same city are doing very well, and they're taking all of the custom. And so why would they come to you, this new place, than the place that they've been going to for years? So the competitiveness and the unique selling point that you need to bring forward is very hard to get right. And just to finish this one off, in the hospitality industry as a whole, especially in restaurants where you're serving food, the chances of complaints are very high. So if you don't get it right straight away up front, then you're going to get a lot of negative reviews, and it's going to be very hard to get off the ground. You need your reviews to be absolutely sky high, especially in the first 6 to 12 months. So again, that's very difficult to get right. Okay, so jumping on to the next idea that I believe you should absolutely avoid, especially for a first business, is to open a gym. And this is another one that sounds very cool, very romantic idea of, opening this amazing gym, meeting loads of new people, having this really cool venue, and it just sounds amazing, to be honest. And I've even thought about doing it before. And that's again why a lot of people go wrong in this, because they don't look at the hard facts. They just think about opening this gym because they really want to do it. It's a passion project, and it just falls flat within the first year. And the statistics for failure for gyms is even worse. It's 80% in the first year, which is really bad. And this is another business that brings ridiculously high costs up front. In fact, this is probably worse than a restaurant, or at least it matches it, because you've got all of the equipment to buy, and it is very, very expensive. And I know this very well because I actually even created a business plan for this. I looked at all of the costs, and you're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds just for the equipment. Yes, you can rent it, and a lot of people will come back with that argument, but when you're renting it, your monthly costs are sky high, and you don't want that. You want to keep those as low as you can. And just think, if you're renting it, eventually to buy it in 5 years, for example, it's a depreciating asset. So within 5 years, that equipment probably needs to be rebought again. And so you're just caught in this cycle of constantly needing to borrow or to lease the equipment. And with gyms, you've got to keep this new wave of cheap 24/7 gyms in mind. And I see people coming into the gym industry only lasting a year or two because they're charging 40, 50 quid. And you go into it and it feels very spit and sawdust, I think they call it. It's very kind of a bit grimy. The machinery is not brand new. It feels a bit dirty in there. It doesn't feel brand new and fresh, which is what a lot of young people want these days. And so, you are competing with a lot of these now. A lot of gyms are around $19.99, $24.99. And if you're a new gym and you leasing the equipment, for example, you're going to need like 500 to 1,000 members very quickly. Because if you're only charging $19.99, for example, you need a lot of customers through the door just to even cover your costs. Yes, you can go into the higher end market, but you need to get it absolutely right. Everything will need to be high end, and it's going to cost you to do that right. And so this point is all about just getting it right. The difficulty is extremely hard, and it needs to be the right quality, it needs to be the right price, your marketing needs to be right, your branding does, and just to get all that right is very difficult, especially if you've not been in business before. Finally, in this one, obviously you've got all of the competition, which I briefly touched upon a little bit earlier. There are so many gyms out there right now, it is untrue. And for me, just like the restaurant idea, you're going to need to be unique and bring something new to the table. And because of all this new wave of digital era and creativity, people are really coming up with awesome, unique ideas. And so most things have already been done. Yes, there's probably the untouched hidden gem there that you could probably do, but again, it's just very difficult to get right. Okay, so the next business I feel you should absolutely avoid is a retail store. And this is another one that sounds very romantic, and it's one of those usually passion-led projects because they just love to have one of these little boutique shops selling cool clothes that they really love, meeting loads of new people, and that is just not the reality of this business. Now, don't get me wrong, with this business, there isn't loads of upfront costs unless the venue isn't fit for purpose and you need to totally refit it out, which, I wouldn't recommend anyway as a first business really. And unless, of course, you want to send really high-end brands like Gucci or something like that. But that's the only, I would say, slight upside to this particular business. But what you will get with this business is you're probably going to be on some kind of high street, or you're probably going to need to be. This is something that I see a lot of small boutique shops go wrong. They want to place themselves on a really nice little cute back alley, but how do people know you're there? You need to be on the forefront of the walking strip or whatever it is in this particular town, and it can be difficult because it's hard to get them anyway, because as soon as they come up, people take them, and they're just very expensive. We're talking thousands, if not sometimes in the tens of thousands. And just like the other businesses, this one, you've got a lot of competition again. And if you think of some really big high street brands like Topman, for example, they are now bust. They've gone under. So if these really big companies are struggling, then if you're a small fish in a big pond, then you're also really going to struggle. Okay, so the next business I feel you should absolutely avoid for your first and maybe ever at all is hotels, which again is something that sounds very romantic, sounds really cool, owning your own hotel, but this is not the reality. And having a hotel is probably, in terms of failure rate, the worst out there, which is 60% in the first year and 80% in the first 5 years, which is absolutely ridiculous. And you can see with that stat alone how much people have problems with getting this business up and running and keeping it successful. So with a hotel, obviously to buy the hotel is very, very expensive. And with any new business, you want to manage a risk as much as possible. And so if it's your very first, you don't want to be going for a business that's extremely heavy loaded to the front in terms of costs. So just to buy the building, you're talking hundreds of thousands, if not in the millions. So for your first business, you need to stay way clear. And it's not just buying it unless it's absolutely tailored to your needs. And if you want to be unique, I'm guessing that it's not going to be the case. Then just to kit that hotel out, the rooms, if you've got a restaurant, if you've got a bar, ridiculously expensive. Let's say you've got 20 rooms, and let's say each room's going to cost you 10 grand, 15 grand. Again, we're talking the hundreds of thousands just to kit it out. And with this business, you're going to need a lot of staff, and there's lots of staff in different areas. And so just managing that in general, operations wise, is extremely stressful and difficult. So if it's your first time, again, you need to stay clear of that. And the cost of it, so cost of staff and the reliance upon staff, good staff, again, is just very difficult to deal with as a new business owner, as any owner, to be honest. But if it's your first, it can become very overwhelming. It can just put you off. And that's probably why the success rate is extremely low in this business. And don't get me wrong, for this business, you don't necessarily need to be very unique. Although if you're going into a city that's got a lot of really cool, unique ideas, you might have to compete. So there is lots of competition in this one, like there is any of the other ones. But I would say you don't need to be as unique, especially if there's a really high need for hotels in that area. But this is a very difficult part of getting the right hotel. It needs to be the right location. The location is key. There's no point getting a hotel just off the motorway, 10 miles away from the main city, where people like to stay in the city for their city breaks, for example. And when you are in that right place in the city, the ongoing cost for that is very expensive, unless of course you've bought it outright, which is usually the case, to be honest. It's very rare you're going to be able to rent a premises like a hotel, but that is definitely possible. But the rates will be absolutely sky high, and Yeah, just costs in general for a city centre location will be very high. Like business rates, for example, are always sky high in city centres, right? And so just factoring that in, you need to probably bring in hundreds of people just to cover your ongoing costs, as well as obviously we've spoken about before, staff costs and just running costs. So electric, gas, etc. are just going to be very high. And one huge downside, especially these days with the likes of Airbnb and service accommodations, there is a lot of competition in terms of price. Obviously, there's more competitors with these homes renting out their rooms on a daily basis, but the prices around very competitive because of those. Hotels might need to charge much lower, like 95, 100 quid, whereas before they were 120 to 150. So being very competitive is problematic in terms of price, because if your monthly costs are very high, you need to get more people in to cover for those lower selling prices. And just like restaurants, hotels and bespoke products, the chances of complaints are very high. Especially if you're wanting to go into something very high end, everything needs to be absolutely perfect, because I know very well people will complain at anything. So again, it just causes more stress. In the first year, you need to make sure those star ratings are very, very high, or else people just won't come. Okay, so the fifth and final business idea that I feel you should absolutely avoid, especially if it's your first, is anything that requires highly skilled people to create bespoke items. Because anything that requires really highly skilled workmen, resources, whatever you want to call them, is very difficult to get right, and you're really reliant upon them people. So it causes a lot of stress, and it can cause tension between you and those people, because they do at some point try and determine what they do, how much they get paid and everything, because they are so highly skilled, and these people know it. And just like a chef in a restaurant that I mentioned earlier, a bespoke carpenter, for example, is like gold dust. And when you get them, they expect a lot. And they know, as I mentioned before, that they are the gold dust. And so they can determine things, they can dictate things, and it's just not a good way to do business. And like with any bespoke product out there, there's always a chance of things going wrong, a much higher chance of things going wrong than just an off-the-shelf item, because off-the-shelf items are just made as they are, and people just have to buy them as they are. With bespoke items, you might need to get measurements, it might be particular pieces of wood or metal, and it's all very specific. And so things to go wrong, the chances for things to go wrong there are extremely high, which then leads on to customer complaints again. With this business, like the restaurant and the gym, the chances of complaints in this industry are absolutely ridiculous. And I know this all too well, because I used to run a bespoke furniture company, and people will complain at the slightest thing. And because it's so bespoke, if you don't get it absolutely right, the complaints are just through the roof. And just in terms of managing the business, it's very, very difficult, because with bespoke products, there's usually not one part of production. For my furniture company, there were 6 parts of production, and each one had its own little specialist skills. So just making sure that runs smoothly and efficiently, and to get people to take ownership of their part and make sure it all runs through, is very difficult. And you need management in there, which also brings extra costs. And that's another thing for this business. The costs are extremely high, more so for the staff, but there's also very high-end materials. Because it's bespoke and it's probably going to be high-end and expensive, you need to get the best materials. And to make whatever you're making, cabinets for example, or kitchens like I did for my furniture company, the machinery is also very expensive. Now I would say that getting into something very bespoke and specialist isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I do believe going into that you can create a niche easier, so you can stand out in the market much easier. But for your first business, there's a lot and probably too many risks and problems that I would say first business owners are just going to really struggle with. But just like a lot of these businesses that I've spoken about today, I'm not saying that you can never do these, And some of them can work, especially if you've done a lot of marketing and so you've got a unique selling point, you're in the right position and your advertising on point, your branding's there. You can make any of these work. But as a first timer, all of these businesses I've spoken about today are just riddled with problems and risks. So as a first business owner, it can be very stressful and overwhelming. And that's probably why most of them fail within the first year. And as a final piece of advice for this video, we need to make our first business as low risk as possible. And with that, you need to make sure your costs are as low as possible. Your competition is low as possible. You need to make sure that you've got a unique selling point and that there's as least staff as possible, especially when it comes to specialist skills. So you're not reliant upon those and they're holding you at the end of a barrel. So I really hope you took a lot from this video and it sparked some ideas in you. And if it's put you off some businesses, then that's not a bad thing, because I'd rather save you hundreds of thousands and the pain of your business failing and losing all your money and just being down and out when it comes to business and having to go back to a 9-to-5 job again, which is not what we want at all. So if you did take a lot of value from this video, please like it, please subscribe so it can get to as many people as possible. And until next time,